Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers. I'm Murray Down, the assistant editor of the magazine, and with me is Jasper Ortage, the editor of Ancient Warfare. Today's question is, how did shock cavalry tactics work without stirrups? So Jasper is going to take us through exactly how that possibly happened.
I think they did. They did work clearly. Um, but this is an idea that's pretty old. I think J.K. Anderson first sort of drew that conclusion. There were no stirrups. The stirrups appear sometime in the late ancient world, sort of probably from Central Asia, and they come into Europe where they're used. And then we think of medieval knights, couched lance, charging in, crash, um, and it's hard to think how you would do that without a stirrup, because that's what we're used to. Because ever since cavalry of horse people, now that's nicely phrased, cavalrymen have used the stirrup to facilitate their riding, and they have the sense that it makes them more secure in the saddle. Um, Thing is, it's difficult to explain this if you don't ride yourself, and I certainly don't. I think the last time I rode a horse was probably at a fun fair. Maybe it wasn't even a horse, but a pony. Um, so perhaps we should talk to somebody who really knows a lot about horses about this question. Uh, I know, enough said that way, but it's clear from for instance, from Xenophon and later writers as well, that ancient horsemen could be very secure on their horse. And that probably meant that they trained in a different way, sat in a different, they call it a deep seat, um, with their legs, instead of straight down, somewhat further sort of bent up, to give them a very secure seat that allowed them to do what they wanted to do and listen to the horse and develop a relationship, so that they were very mobile in the horse. So that's one. Two, we have to remember that most ancient cavalry is fairly light cavalry that used either bow and arrow, although that's not as much of a thing for the Greeks and Romans, but certainly is in the ancient Near East and steppe peoples. Or they use javelins, and for throwing a javelin you need a secure seat, but you don't get that shock, of course. Um, but later on we see cavalry that sort of as under Alexander, certainly, where you get cavalry that is armed with clearly a thrusting spear, or even a lance, and obviously the object there is to ride toward your enemy and stick him with it. The question is, do we have to think of this as somebody who gets to close proximity and uses the height advantage of the horse and the mobility to stab at his enemy, um, and then perhaps ride away again? Or is this actually shock cavalry, as in charging home and using the momentum of the horse, um, still there, using the momentum of the horse to impact your enemy and impale him, in fact, with your lance? Um, and we don't really know what that was like. Um, Third is, you have to question, what do the stirrups really do? And I have this from reading, not from personal experience, but it is said that the stirrups help you with lateral movement. They don't help you uh, cushion or secure you against a shock that you get when you impact something hard with your lance, and the force moves forward through the lance and tries to push you off the rear of the horse, in effect. And that's probably why you see the medieval saddle has a high back, a high cantle, which secures the knight in his seat and stops him from falling out when he charges home and brings that shock. So that you could argue that yes, the stirrups help him, but the real thing that allows him to perform that charge is the saddle and not the stirrups. And as coincidence would have it, there is an ancient saddle, and we've talked about this before. It's the famous four-horned saddle that the Romans introduced, probably in the, I think it's in the 1st century BC, which is, it's a sturdy wooden frame with two horns at the back that seat the back of the hips, and two horns in front that go over the thighs, which apparently, so I'm told, provide a very secure seat for the horseman. So that would certainly allow you to charge home and brace yourself for the force of that impact. So that's kind of a vague answer. I realize it's kind of like, well, we don't know how much they really charged home, apart from cataphracts who are clearly described as doing so. And they must have had a very good, a lot of training to have a very strong seat, perhaps an adapted saddle. But that seems how they did it. And otherwise, cavalry is mostly about being mobile, being higher up than the rest, and using that mobility and that height to throw ranged weapons or fire ranged weapons. Do you have anything to add there, Murray?
Well, I was just going to say that, the idea of shock tactics tends to be into broken troops or into a gap. Again, Alexander's use of the companion cavalry he's extended the line of the Persians at the Battle of Issus and the Battle of Gaugamela, and also at the Granicus. So he's created a gap in the enemy line, and then he charges his cavalry into the gap. So it's not the idea of a cavalry charge into a solid force of infantry, and you'll get many horse riders talk about the fact that a horse won't ride at what it perceives to be a solid object. You'll get others saying that, when you look at show jumping, the idea, of course, is to show your mastery as a horseman, that your horse will jump what it perceives to be a solid object because it trusts the rider. Now, it's a really interesting, again, not being a horseman, the last time I was on a horse, the horse in front of me kicked, and my horse dodged the kick, and I got kicked in the shins. So that was 15 years ago, so I haven't been on a horse since. But the interesting thing with that is the idea that, would you use cavalry? You certainly wouldn't use infantry cavalry, light cavalry, sorry, against a heavy infantry. You wouldn't sort of send light cavalry charging at a phalanx or at a legion with a solid line of shields. Heavy cavalry, then you run into the issues of, would they charge home against what they perceive to be a solid wall of men? And it's very hard to answer without having done it or seen it.
But a couple thousand people to try it, yeah.
Yeah, which, a lot of people aren't willing to volunteer.
I think we also have to always try and keep in mind what are we picturing when we talk about shock cavalry. As you said, if Alexander charges into a weak point or into a stretched point of an enemy line where there perhaps is hardly anybody, you can imagine, as if you're among the few infantrymen in that gap, you're going to have to be made of very solid stuff to want to stay in place. So there is hardly any real impact. It's just, it's the morale impact, really, of that cavalry thundering at you and giving the impression that they are not going to go, if you don't move, they don't care. And then the cavalry gets into the flank of a phalanx and probably causes panic. And as I said, you can probably be extremely lethal and have that morale effect if suddenly, there's phalangites are in a phalanx and suddenly on their side there is cavalry that is stabbing down at them from on high, from a direction that they can't protect themselves very well. And you can see how you could do that very well if you're a confident rider with or without stirrups, and you don't even have to worry about the shock of the impact. I think when we think about shock and impact cavalry, we think of medieval tournaments, perhaps, or Napoleonic cuirassiers.
Yeah, but again, the infantry square, if they panicked and broke, they were gone. But if they stayed in their square against Napoleonic cavalry, the cavalry would be very. I think it was at Wagram there was a horse that got shot, bowled into the infantry square, and therefore opened a channel through the infantry, and so in came the rest of the cavalry. But that's a very rare. You couldn't plan that. So again, I think it was about the infantry standing their ground, and so
and what you say, if you lure the enemy into stretching their formation until it's thin as breaking point, or say at Carrhae, where the Parthian horse archers get closer and they concentrate on shooting at the Romans, shooting so much until there's weak points or they're wavering at certain points, and that's where the heavy cavalry goes in, the cataphracts, and bowling and intimidating and getting into the formation that way and using their lances from afar. Well, it needs more study or perhaps reenactment. It might be hard to find volunteers to do that.
Yeah, to do the infantry part of it, perhaps that would be harder to find the reenactors.
Yeah, maybe that too. It comes down, I think, to one of the big questions that we have about ancient warfare. What really decides the battle? Is it, it's probably the morale factor, but it's the hardest to pin down how that would go.
Yeah, you've got to experience it to know how it's going to sort of wear out, unfortunately.
Yeah, which is probably not a very pleasant experience.
No, I wouldn't want to. There you go. So they did, is basically our answer.
They did it anyway.
They did, yes, absolutely. So there you have it. Shock cavalry tactics without stirrups. We will see you next time.